Hello everybody. Welcome to another introductory tutorial. As with the last one, if you're joining us again, this one was designed for a course named IAT 235, Information and Web Design, for Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. This time around, we're going to be moving from HTML to CSS, and we're going to begin to use the HTML and CSS to change the unstyled, just Times New Roman, blue links, randomness of page content that we designed in HTML last week, and we're going to start applying instructions to these to change things like font type, links, button color, button appearance, image handling, and a lot of other things that sort of continue to go along with this as well. So that's where we're going to be headed. As before, there's a starter file that you'll be able to make use of. That starter file will be linked in the details on this YouTube tutorial, and you should be looking for a zip file that looks like this, and inside that you will see the completed file structure that we had upon the completion of the HTML tutorial that we went through before this. And so this time around, we're not going to make very many changes to our HTML. Most of the work we're going to do is going to be related to external CSS files and the style sheets instructions inside them that will start allowing us to change the visual appearance of the content that we marked up. And so that's where we're going to head to. So to start us off, we are going to need to go to our website itself. So in my case, to get to this, I went to File, and then I went to Open, and I just opened the folder itself. If you're using a newer version of Sublime Text, there should be a Open Folder menu item, which you can use for the same purpose to open the folder. And you'll see with the existing file and folder structure that we've got set up there, we've got our HTML files, we've got our images in the same place our images are, and we have the CSS directory that we made last time, but there's nothing in it. So one of the first things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to both put a CSS file in that location, and we're going to link it in our HTML. But in the case of me and how I tend to always do things backwards, we are going to link the file before it exists. So in our HTML, the thing to remember in terms of what we're expecting is that we link the external the style sheet as an external file rather than writing any style sheet instructions in our HTML in the head tag, which we could do, but we choose not to do that because we are trying to reach a sort of a maximum level of modularity and ease of maintenance and editing with the web content that we make. And if I make this as a separate file, I can then link that CSS file to any and all HTML files that may need to use it. And if I need to make a change so that I can change the appearance of my website, I just need to change the instruction in the CSS file and don't have to go and alter every single page of HTML that I've written. And so that's why we're going to link it this way. And the way we're going to link it is we're going to use a link element, and specifically the attributes it's going to have is an href attribute, which is where we're going to then tell it where the file path is. And in this case, the file path is going to be CSS, because that's the name of the directory. We're going to put our file in, / and then the file name. You can, there's a certain amount of freedom you have with the name of this. There's no sort of rule like index.html where you have to sort of make it the same thing. Some people choose to call their main file style.css, some people other things. I tend to prefer main.css because it seems a little bit more descriptive to me. And then the other thing we'll need to do with this link is we'll need to set up a rel attribute telling it what it is, in this case a style sheet, so the browser knows what it's dealing with. And with that linked in our HTML, we're going to save our HTML, and for now we're not going to do anything else to it. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file, and we're immediately going to save it, and specifically we're going to save it as, and in the CSS directory, we're going to call it main.css so that the two things match. And then we're going to do the bulk of our work for today's tutorial in this space specifically. So one of the first things to note with HTML, with CSS, sorry, is that it has a little bit of a different syntax for how to write things. One of the first things that's different is how one actually writes a comment. And in the case of CSS, if we want to write a comment, we do this /* and then we end it with */. And that can create a block level comment where we can write things afterwards. In this case, what we're going to write here is basically welcome. The other thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to write something up very, very briefly that describes to you how declarations are typically structured in CSS. And so when it comes to CSS, the first thing that you'll generally have is you'll have a selector. The selector will correspond to something in your HTML file that you're telling the CSS, go get this thing, and then you're going to have a pair of curly braces, and inside these curly braces are going to be instructions related to the appearance, the size, and the scale, and the weight, and the layout, and the positioning, and other things related to giving instructions related to the visual appearance of what we're working with. And that's generally going to be formatted in the following way. There's going to be a particular property, and then there's going to be a colon, and then there's going to be a value, ended by a semicolon. And you can have as many of these properties as you like and as exist for that particular selector. And doing so, you can change things like the color of the font, the typeface of the font, how much space there is around that content, what kind of space there is, what color the background is, whether that background is an image, whether that background is anything else. There's lots and lots and lots of properties that you can specify. Today, we're not going to focus very much on layout properties. That's going to be coming up in a future tutorial. What we're mostly going to be focusing on is sort of the simple visual styling so that you can get used to how this type of instructions work, as well as so that you can sort of set a consistent sort of base for the majority of the basic tags that are going to appear in all of your HTML pages. And by setting all of sort of like the base level default tags and the default settings for those tags, we're going to create a situation where out of all the HTML pages that we create after this, they are going to look consistent with each other with a minimum of special customization needed. And then later on, we'll then be able to layer anything that is custom on top of the basics, which is our first step here. And so that's how that's generally going to go. So when we then get into that, down below our comment, as I said, we're going to go through this beginning with the basic tags. So if we shift over to our HTML, what I'm talking about is things like the body element, the header element, paragraph elements, all the various headings, what a nav should look like, what's the basics for anchor tags, what's the basic layout considerations for images, for figure tags, lists, etc. And so it's like all the just sort of like base level elements. And we want to sort of have a consistent look across every single page we make. So if we go in here, the first one we're going to do is the least specific. So if I do something to body, this will control how things appear, not only for body itself, but remember, it's sort of like it's going to make the properties that you declare and the values you set for them apply to the children of the tag. So everything that's contained between the opening and ending of body is, of course, all the rest of this stuff. And so if we want to set a universal typeface that the entire page is going to use, there's no point in writing a specific typeface for every single individual element, because again, that wastes the idea of being able to make a small change when I need to alter things. And so by having it apply to one thing, we have a lighter weight set of instructions. And so in this case, we're going to set our base default font in body. And then if we want to ever set a custom font for something else, we'll set that on the custom declaration. But otherwise, we want everything to look like this. So the first thing that's going to be is if you want to deal with font, you can't just write font. In the end, you have to actually write font family. And there's a specific reason for this. So this particular property can take a series of values, and that series of values tends to look as follows. A name of a font, comma, a name of a font, comma, name of a font, or typeface if you're being accurate. So in this case, what we've got going on here is what's called a fallback. So the property is the font family, and the values are the family of fonts that you're wanting it to work through. And how this works is the way that CSS and HTML in browsers handle typefaces by default is it pulls from the fonts that are pre-installed on the user's computer. And so there are ways that you can specify a typeface that they don't have, but it requires some special instructions and special systems. More advanced, we'll talk about that in the future. Right now, at the basic level, assume that you have limited control over the typeface that your user sees, because you can't control what typeface they have installed. And so this is why we have to set these fallbacks. So what this is saying is the font should be Helvetica if the user has Helvetica. If the user does not have Helvetica, show it in Arial. And if for whatever reason they don't have Arial, use a default just base sans serif. And in addition to the sort of fallbacks of these different typefaces, we can also specify a great deal of other things related to the typography itself. For the body, though, we're not going to get into most of them, but I am going to just specify one last thing, which is the font size, just so we can sort of set a default sort of base size for the typeface. And when we're doing this, we're going to start getting used to some techniques that are going to be useful to us in the future by trying to use relative units wherever possible, so that we're building our website styling from the ground up with the intention of having it be responsive. And so what this means in this case is, instead of saying 16 point type or 16 pixel type, which are both absolute static values, and they can't sort of change relative to the settings that a user might put into your system that will potentially increase the font size if they have some sort of visual impairment and they need to be able to see and read something at a larger size to be effective. So in the event that instead of setting that 16 pixels, we were to say 1.25 rem, what that basically means is 1.25 relative to the root font size. And the root font size is the default for the browser, which in the case of Chrome is typically 16 pixels or 16 point. And so by setting it to 1.2, we're setting the default to be slightly larger than that 16 point typeface. And that's because we're setting it to body is now sort of like the default font size for everything that we're working with. So another thing that we can then do is set our actual type hierarchies themselves. So as an example, if we were to say H1, then we could go in there, and if an H1 is the top level of hierarchy, it's the biggest typeface, and so we're going to set that to be font-size as well, and we're going to set that font size to 3 rem, so 3 times the size of the default. And then we're going to go to our H2, and we're going to set that to a font size of 2 rem. And then, because I don't think we have any H3s in our site, well, actually we probably do, just in case. So let's go H3, font size, 1.6 rem. And then lastly, we're going to deal with our paragraph. And that one we're going to set as font size 1 rem. And this is a general recommendation that I would have, is that your paragraph is usually whatever your default is. So I could set this as 1 rem, and then I'd have basically a paragraph at 16 point. Or I could have said, let's let the base be 1.25, in which case this would probably be closer to 18 or 20, and sort of let it go. So both ways are potentially viable. So this is good. By setting this to P, this is just going to mean that only other things that are neither a paragraph nor headings is going to be that 1.25, which will default things like H4s and H5s to 1.25 and a few other things. And so even without declaring the H4 and 5 hierarchy, we still sort of get our font size looking like this. So I can show you a few more things, but one of the things that's really important at this point is that we make sure that the linking of the style sheet is actually functioning, and the font sizes, the font settings are actually functioning. So we're going to save this, and then we're going to head over to our browser, and we're going to reload this. And what we should see is this stuff all through here should switch and into a sans serif, and there's a good chance that we're going to see the size of these heading elements change as well. So let's just reload and see what happens. And there you go. Much bigger, because we set that font size. Everything is sans serif. And you'll notice that things that are bold are still bold, and that's because there is default styling that is being set in. So you see this user agent style sheet. So this is in the absence of any styling instructions of your own, the browser itself has a browser default that it's applying. And so in the case of a lot of the things you see here, it's going to be sort of doing that. And so if, as an example, we were to go to body, and you'll see we've got this, then the user agent says body should be display block, and then it should have a default margin of 8 pixels, which just creates some space off the edge. So if we wanted to change any of those, if the moment I write this instruction into the CSS, it's going to overwrite what's in this user agent. So if we go back over to here and we go to take a look at it, let's go back over to body, and let's say 1 rem. And so right now it's at 8. So if we set it to 1 rem, it should probably double. So let's save that and just go take a look. So it pushes in a little bit. You see how the 8 pixels has been overwritten because now we've got this 1 rem here. You can actually turn that off and on to see how the effect is happening, which is kind of handy. The other thing to note is when I hover over certain instructions or certain elements, it gets highlighted in our browser, which shows us things like the content area, or in the case of this, the content and its margin. And there's an important thing that when I was first learning HTML and CSS, it took me forever to realize about layout, which is that if you have a bottom margin, such as the one that we see underneath the H1 here, and you have a top margin, such as the one that's on this paragraph, they don't sit outside each other. They actually collapse into each other. And so you'll notice here with H1, if we look at this and it says, you know, this, whether that's the margin that it's applying, I'm not sure. This margin block end, 0.67 em, that's probably what the size of that margin is, which you see here is this 32.1 pixels. And we go to this P here and we see what's their margin, and it's 1 em, which we then see is 16. So that's that default font size. But we don't have 32 plus 16, we have 32 pixels of space, because the smaller one collapses into the larger one, and we only have that. And this, as I say, this used to throw me off because I thought I was creating the right amount of space and I didn't realize they were collapsing into each other. And as a result, back when I was younger, I would have my navigation sitting on top of things and the heading collapsing into the navigation because the margins that were happening weren't connecting. So when you realize that the margins collapse into each other, you'll start to have a much more predictable way of handling things. There's lots of ways that you can deal with this. One of the ways that used to be fairly common for a lot of web developers that I knew was that they would just decide, okay, you know what, we're going to strip bottom margins off of everything, and everything's going to be governed by top margins, and we're going to set the spacing that way. Or you could do it where everything's got a bottom margin and everything doesn't have a top. Or you could just manage it. All ways are potentially valid, as long as you know what's happening and how your spacing is being controlled. So if we then go back into our code, we can start to take a look at this. So with the H1 as an example, if we were to say margin bottom 0, now it's not going to have a margin. And if we go back to our browser and we reload, you'll see it's a lot closer to each other because now the space is being caused by the 16 pixels and there's no margin on the bottom there. So now the space is being controlled more consistently. And thus we get hopefully what we were hoping for. And we can do this in a variety of other settings too. Like if we go down to our kitten section and there's an H2 in the kittens right there. And that's something that potentially we could deal with as well. So if we were to go in here and we were to say H2, and again we say margin bottom, whoops, that's not how you write that, bottom 0. And that gets a little closer. Just a little though, because one of the things you'll notice is, oh no, it's good. It's the figure that's causing it. There's space on the figure, and as a result, that's what's pushing it still. So they're not collapsing into each other anymore now either, which is great. So let's see if there's some other things that we can start start applying the stuff. In terms of this, keeping everything consistent for myself, I think I'm going to keep doing this margin bottom thing on the H3 as well. And so one thing to note is like this margin bottom that I keep writing on things is potentially a little bit annoying to have to do all over and over again. And so one of the things that you can do with that is like if I decided that paragraphs should be 1 rem and ordered lists should be 1 rem and unordered lists should all be 1 rem. I can do it like this with these commas. So yeah, this is one of those ones to be careful and know sort of which is which in terms of what you're working with. And in this case, if you go selector, comma, selector, comma, selector, what this basically is saying, this one and this one and this one all take this instruction. In the event that you were to say use spaces, this means something different. This is saying an unordered list that is a child of an ordered list, which is a child of a paragraph, which we don't have anywhere. There's no such thing. So let's keep going. Oh, can't leave that. That'd be unfortunate. There we go. So a couple other things to look at. Let's just save this for a second and go back to our browser. So if we look at the actual image itself, if we like resize our browser window, and we get to the edge there, notice how the image doesn't resize. I get to the edge and it's just gone. It's still there. And if I were to inspect this and make this really small and set this to mobile, it's getting cut off again. And I have to scroll to see all the web content. And I'm scrolling because this image over here is doing that too. So what that means is none of these images are resizing when the window resizes, which means they're causing us some problems with responsiveness. So one of the things we want to do is we want to set the properties for our image tag, and we want to build in that sort of responsive resizing as best we can. And so there's a couple things that we're going to do to make that happen. The first thing is we set the height, and we set that to auto. And what this means is that if the image resizes, the height should adjust automatically when the width changes. And then we're going to, when we set the width, what we're going to do is we're going to say max width instead of just width, which is we're saying the maximum width that this can have is 100%, which is saying don't exceed 100% of the parent element, which at the moment is body, so don't become larger than the body tag, and thus don't become larger than the browser window. And so that means when the browser window becomes smaller than the image, it would be more than 100%, and so it would have to resize to shrink. The other thing that it'll do with the max width is it won't become larger than the image itself. And that's one of the reasons why in the HTML we have the image tag with its width and height set, so that we can also make sure that it doesn't oversize itself at any point. So by setting that max width to 100%, we can go through here and we can save that. And now with those two instructions set, we should be able to go in here, reload this, and now when the browser resizes, you see it resize. So it's resizing before the browser hits the edge, and that's probably because what's happening in terms of the figure. So when the figure starts to have to shrink, because the container that this is in is actually in a figure container, that's resizing. This is also, notice how this one's closer to the edge because it's not in a figure, but I also noticed that it was resizing much earlier, but it is resizing proportionally and nothing's being squished. And so just by doing those two simple instructions, and because I did that to image default, all image tags, any image tag I ever make, means that all of the images that I might put in, however many hundreds of pages that might be part of this website in the end, will be responsive by default. So, a couple other things we can play with. So figure. So that's one of the things that was a little bit odd right now, because right now this image is in a figure, this one isn't. This one's going full width, there's no edges, this one's got is indent, and that's because there's a margin that's applied. So let's keep doing our thing where we're practicing this. So the default for figure, same as before, margin 0. Similarly, we can set something for fig caption. And in this case, we're going to set the font style. And so a font style, unlike size and everything else, we're going to do with italic, although you could have that font style be bold or any number of other things. And that's going to change how that appears. So type isn't the only thing that we can do stuff to, although I'm going to do stuff to type at least a couple more times. But when it comes to type, we're not just worrying about spacing and size or thickness or angle. We also can care about color. So where we're going to take a look at that is right now, if you look in the browser, all of this is black and that's all wonderful, but all of these are bright blue. And that says to the user, this is unstyled, because we're used to seeing blue links as a default visual look. And so if we want to change that default look of color, we set our anchor tag. And the funny thing is all the rest of these things have been writing font size, font weight, font family, font whatever. But when it comes to changing the font color, we just write color. And I don't know why, it's just how it goes. And there's lots of ways that we can then write color. We can write just the color like that. We can use hex, and we can say like that. Or we can use RGB, which means red, green, blue. We can also use RGBA, which is red, green, blue, alpha, which is transparency. For now, though, we're going to use RGB because it gives us the most fine control. And we're going to set this to 50, 0, 0. And if it's red, green, blue, then that means that it's some red and no of the others, which is going to make that a dark red, is my expectation. The other thing we're going to do, we're going to rip those underlines off because designers hate underlined links. Meanwhile, Donald Norman and Jakob Nielsen are mad at us for stripping off those things. But one way or the other, they can't hurt us, so none. And that gets the anchor. So before we show you a last thing, I want to show you another couple neat things with styling links, which is that we also can add instructions into our CSS that connect to user interaction and how the browser reacts to user interaction. And the specific reaction that we can have that is most commonly set is hover state, and we're going to use the and again. And in this case, the focus as well as active. So that way, if you have a mouse, then you can hover, you'll see this. But if you're using a keyboard and you're tabbing between items, you'll see the same thing when it's selected. And in this case, what will happen is if you set an instruction that is in here that is the same as the instruction that you made there, but you make a change, then when hover is true, this will overwrite this. And so in this case, what color do I want? RGB, GB, and I'm going to say 200, 0, 0. So when it's hovered, it's going to get darker. I'm going to save that. So let's go back over to here and reload. Dark, dark, dark red. Hover, bright. It's a bit abrupt right now, though. And because it's so dark, it's not really communicating as interactive because it's quite close to this. And that's not very smart of me. As much as I just finished saying that Nielsen and Norman can't hurt me, they are right in the sense that the user has to know that something's clickable. And if we're not going to do that with text decoration, we can do something else. And so what I'm going to suggest is let's make this the bright one and this the dark one. And that's going to make that a little bit clearer. The other thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to have a little bit of fun. And so in our anchor, there's another thing we can do, and that is when reacting to user input and when the color changes, we can set an animation too. And so in this case, we're going to set a transition. And we're saying transition the color and a transition duration of 0.5 seconds, let's say. And so you set that transition on the thing that is changing, and then when something else like the hover state changes that color, you'll see that animate. Just for fun, let's also say text decoration line. Yeah, sure. So now there it's red, hover, and it fades a little bit darker. The text decoration doesn't do anything, so I wrote that wrong. I can't remember. The only thing I ever do with text decoration is get rid of it. I never add it, so that's not too surprising. So we'll just skip that. All right, so let's look at a few other things that can just give you a little bit more of a sense. So what we're going to do now is what we've got right now, if we look at it all the way through, even though we haven't done too many instructions, is already starting to sort of make some changes to this overall layout, or this overall look. So one of the things I now want to do is I want to show you a couple other sort of color things that we can do, but I also want to show you a quick spacing layout thing. And this isn't most of the layout tutorial we're going to do later, but one of the things that you may find that you're used to seeing is web pages that don't span the full width of the browser. This is especially if you're working on like, you know, a 1080p or higher display, you'll often have sort of like the content area doesn't go the whole way. And this is sometimes going to be the case because like the line widths on your paragraphs getting too large and it just being impractical. And we could, of course, set the max width on paragraphs so that it doesn't take up too much, it doesn't ever get too wide. But the other thing we can try and do is we can set that in terms of how the content container works. And so we're just going to go into our HTML and we're going to add a couple things to the HTML that takes us through. And one of the things I'm going to do that's kind of fun is I'm going to leave the header alone. And before these sections and everything else, I'm going to put a little div here. And we're going to add a new property, or new attribute that we haven't used up until now, which is the class attribute. And the class attribute is different from the ID attribute that we used below here, because the ID attribute is unique. You can only have one kitten ID on your page, whereas a class attribute you can have anywhere. So in this case, the class attribute I'm going to provide it is main container. And then all the way at the bottom here, we're going to end that. And just so you know, I have a practice, which is that if I've got a div, which are kind of semantically inert, and you can oftentimes have multiple divs nested one after another if you're using them to create grids and layouts, which we're going to do in a more advanced tutorial. And as a result of that, so that I know which one I'm looking at if I can't see the class name on the opening, is I add a comment at the end. And I just say end of dot, because that's how we do the selection of class in CSS. Main container. And so we're adding a class there. I also want to do some stuff with the navigation, and I want to make the navigation look a little bit more like an actual nav bar. And so what we're going to do to make that happen is we are going to add a class onto that as well. So in this case, if I go to nav, and I'm going to say class equals, now I'm going to set that class as nav main item. Sorry, not item. What am I doing? Just nav main. And then for each of these individually, if I wanted, I could actually also add a class to them, and I could add that. And just so you get a sense of what I mean by classes can be applied to multiple things, we're going to call this nav main item. That's where that goes. And you'll see do that better. We'll just save that. So let's go back into our main.css. So if we wanted to do stuff to our main, we can. Specifically though, we're going to start actually by just sort of setting the defaults still. And so like anything that's of nav, we want to have sort of look a particular way for us. We are going to set dot nav main and item. So this is going to be acting on the nav item is not the nav bar. And you'll see, so this is a class declaration, so .nav main, whereas this is just an element. If I were, by the way, to select an ID, I would use pound. So like that. But we're going to use class declarations today with this. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to start by changing the display properties. So generally there's three kinds of displays. You can either have block, which means that it's full width of the browser window by default, and the next element stacks underneath it. And so that's what you see with the individual paragraphs. Then there's inline, which is the default for, say, anchors as an example. So when we look at the browser right now, all of our links are sitting side by side because they're by default inline elements, and so that means that each individual anchor sits side by side the other one as long as there's room. The problem with this is if we set the display to inline, or if the display is set to inline, then if I say background color, and I were to set that, say, to RGB 250 175, and then I were to set something like font size 1.5 rem, which is fine, we can do that, that's all good. But then, and we of course want to set the actual font color to white so that it stands out nicely on that bright orange. But then if I then say set padding, and I could say left, right, top, or bottom, by the way, so I could say padding left and set the padding to the left. Or I can use a shorthand, and this is true of a lot of things, so padding is just one of them. And so if I were to say 0.5 rem, so what that means, what I would just say padding is top right, bottom, and left all will be 0.5 rem. If, on the other hand, I say 0.5 rem space 0.75 rem, what that means is top and bottom will be 0.5, and left and right will be 0.75. If, on the other hand, I were to do, say, what that's saying is top 0.5 rem, right 0.75 rem, bottom 1 rem, left 2 rem. We're not going to do that, I just wanted you to know that's how that works. We're just going to do top and bottom, then left and right, and keep them equal and consistent as all things should be. So I set that, and the padding, because when we talk about, there's a box model that happens. You have content, then you have the padding. The padding will share the same background color as the content. Then you'll have a border if you want one, and then you'll have margin. Margin is typically transparent. It doesn't share any background colors with anything. So margin is typically the space between elements. Padding is the space around content. And so we set the padding, and we save, and we go over here, and the background's turned white, and there's some space around here, but I don't know if the padding's doing its thing. There's margin, you can see that when we hover over it, but you'll notice there's no padding. Or if there is padding and margin, it seems to be almost the same thing. That might be my fault or something else that I did elsewhere. Regardless, what we should see is if we go in here and we set this to display inline block, we should hopefully see that change. And I'll be curious if it doesn't change. We'll see. Yeah, got a little bit bigger, so the padding's being accepted a bit more. And if we hover over it, come on. It still looks the same, but I think it got bigger. And that's where that stuff goes. And you can transition this as well, and you can transition different things. So as an example, if we do the same thing we did with the anchor hover, and if we say transition property background color, we go transition duration, and this time, so that we can really see it, we're going to set it to 1 second. And we're going to set transition timing function, And of course, if you're like, okay, well, what the hell, where do I know where these things are? How do I know this? In the end, you got to look it up. Eventually, you'll start to memorize the ones that you use most often, but to know what properties and what values they can be set, that's the whole reason why repositories like W3 Schools and CSS Tricks and everything else exist, is in part to tell you what all the things are that you can do in terms of styling and otherwise for a particular piece of content. So if we set all that stuff, and then we just have to do, again, .nav-main-item hover. And just to quickly copy and paste to make this go faster. Focus, and then we set the background color. Sorry, we set the, why did we set the color? Sorry. Background color. And that's going to be RGB again. Whoops, RGB. And 50, 50, 50. So now, save that, go back. We should now see type color change, but not the background color. So what have I done wrong? I do this a lot. That's common. Try again. So why were we changing the color? Well, that's why. Because the anchor instruction is telling it to go dark. And so we want to say, no, no, no. Keep that white, because both hover is true. And the one that's going to be applied is the most specific, and nav main hover is more specific, but if it doesn't say anything, then the old one will get applied. So that's more like it. All right, so the one last thing I wanted to show you. So we were in the index.html, and you remember I made that main container. So if we want to have some fun with that, we can go into our main.css, and we're going to do one last thing, which is we're going to say .main container. And you can then go in here and you can set something like, say, max width. And typically we don't set like harsh pixel values. We do try and still do it with rems, but we can use but let's say, assume that we want sort of like our max window width to be, say, 1,000. And so if we were to sort of briefly math that out, so looking about 60.2.5, so let's just sort of rough that and say 63 rem. And then let's save this. So if that's all we do, we just set that maximum width on main container. We go back in here and we reload. We should see, it might change. Depends on how much room there might be. Of course, that paragraph's happening up above. So of course that's not going to work because that's where the container is. But you see this one, notice how that's actually not going full width anymore. And so it only starts to do that when it gets smaller. So now we've got a fixed width, but it's all on the left side here. And so left-aligned design can be okay, but one of the things you'll notice with web is oftentimes if there is that width, that sort of setup, is that the max width area is centered. And so the way that we can do that is with margin. And this time specifically we're going to say 0 auto. So what's that saying is no margin top and bottom, the left and right margin automatic. So resize to maintain equal in both directions. Reload this, and now we've got this column in the center. The stuff up above is still going full width because the container below is the one that has that. And so as a result, you have all of this content in the middle. So one of the ways that we can try and see this a little bit better is we can again work with background color. So let's go all the way over to body. And let's set the background color of body to, say, like very, very light gray. think this is a light gray. I can never remember. Well, one way to make sure I get it right, let's go RGB. And we will say 220, 220, 220. That's guaranteed to be a light gray. Reload. Now everything in the background is gray. Cool. And then what you can do is you can say, let's go down to our main container, and we can say background color white. And then we see where the content is there. We see how it's taking up the space. There's still a few other things that you potentially might want to have a bit of space. Obviously, the image having no margin is suddenly a bit of a problem. And so having a little bit of that set up is probably something that we can do as well. There's a few ways you can achieve that. We can say the main container. Similarly, you can have padding 1 rem as an example, and that'll give us that 16 pixels around all the edges. And now we start to have some space to breathe. But notice how it made it a little bit wider, and that's because the box model we're using right now, when you set a width and height, that's the content, and then the padding's outside of that. If we change the box model, which we will in a later tutorial, that will no longer be true. And we'll start to see how that can start to work a little bit more. Similarly, if we were going here, instead of this margin 0 auto, which is sort of like a classic layout thing, but we could say, you know, margin 1 rem auto, and that would give us a little bit of breathing room from the navigation, just to sort of set that off. So there's lots of things you can do like that to sort of control your content and your sort of web layouts, if such is your wish. And that's where we'll kind of leave this one, I think. There's lots more that you can do and control, but I'm going to let you explore in terms of getting any deeper into how this stuff will work. And this is most of what those of you who are taking this tutorial as part of the course that I'm teaching will need if you are hoping to complete this week's assignment, because this is the main thing we're asking you to do. Styling of typefaces, styling of backgrounds, handling the spacing, and stuff like that. And then next week we'll be doing layout and columns and grids and start making things look like they're supposed to in that respect. And so stay tuned for that.